we started the conference with Chris and myself talking about austerity and poverty in the UK, how this has changed over the last 10 years. And then Chris gave us some of our headline findings, which emphasised that poverty ultimately needs to be seen as morally unacceptable if change is going to happen. So we need a bold, intersectional and multidisciplinary theology that challenges unjust structures. We then heard Peter Scott talking about the theology of poverty and the poverty of theology. Peter raised questions such as, when is poverty poverty? What actually is poverty? And he spoke to us using Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff to talk about different ways of understanding poverty, including spiritual poverty and solidarity with the poor, ultimately ending up with an ecclesiology of poverty. We then heard from Life on the Breadline's Robert Beckford talking about the Black Church, Black theology and austerity. And Robert questioned why some Black churches and groups haven't really been aware of austerity. And he looked at that through historical austerity and through the African Caribbean work ethic and through kincraft. We then had the first of our workshops, which was a World Cafe workshop in which many of you took part as a way of trying to recreate some of that networking that if we had been able to meet in person, if it weren't for the pandemic, some of those conversations that we might have had over a cup of tea or over lunch. So in small groups, we discussed what brings you to the conference, what are some examples of poverty and austerity in your local community, how are faith groups responding to poverty and austerity in your local community, and finally, how would you like to see your local community change in the future? Our second workshop, Chris and I looked at how we've researched poverty during Life on the Breadline, how we've combined interviews with national church leaders, an online survey with regional leaders, and 6 case studies. And then we talked about some of the challenges of researching poverty, how to do that sensitively, what language can be used, and the strengths of an ethnographic approach. And we then had breakout rooms where practitioners, church leaders and academics came together in different groups to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities in researching poverty. We then ended with our guest speaker, Naomi Maynard. Thank you again, Naomi. Naomi spoke to us about how, having attended the Life on the Breadline workshop back in 2019, she was challenged at the end of that workshop, along with everyone else who took part, what change were we going to make in relation to structural injustice. So Naomi talked about different experiences of austerity and then how she and others in her local community have been working to tackle food poverty, in particular establishing a local pantry. That brings us on to where Anthony Reddy gave us our second guest talk, where he looked at the different historic notions of the deserving and undeserving poor and some of the challenges that come with that, talking about solidarity and concluding that we need our praxis to be in line with our voting and our ethics. So a challenge from Anthony there. Chris then presented on some of the work that he's been carrying out with Notting Hill Methodist Church in the shadow of Grenfell Tower. Talked about the octopus of poverty. We've got the octopus in the centre of the screen there, and how poverty is a form of violence and the housing injustice that people have experienced. I then spoke about food banks, which has been another of our case studies, looking at how people's experiences of food banks and the atmospheres of food banks are formed by clients and volunteers of food banks and how that's changed over the last decade of austerity. Robert then brought us a workshop on austerity, intersectionality, and youth crime, where we watched Robert's film that he's made as part of Life on the Breadline of the Swords into Plowshares. We just had a workshop on asset-based community development with Al, Paul, and Sarah and Claire, who are two of our street connectors, where we learned about an approach that focuses on assets and gifts rather than deficits. And that brings us full circle. We've just heard from Chris launching the Life on the Breadline Anti-Poverty Charter and reflections from Deacon Eunice Atwood on that. Thank you, Eunice.